Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Dear viewers, let me welcome you to another episode of Sirat al-Mustaqim, the straight path, my journey through life and some of the events that befell me as I did the journey. Today I would like to talk about a couple of trips that we made. It's a cultural program, or part of a cultural program. Out of the blue, I got an invitation to go to China with something called the People-to-People Citizen Ambassador Program. Okay, now this was initially a program that was set up by Dwight Eisenhower after the Second World War, where he felt that people could play an important part in helping to rebuild a country after the war, ordinary people. The idea was to make contact and maybe develop business contacts and so on from there, so that the trade could actually increase. And someone in the States has actually trawled through professional societies, computer societies, and picked my name up because it appeared on two of them. And so I was invited to go with this delegation, which was a IT type delegation, to China. And I could take my wife. Okay, of course we had to pay, but I mean, the question was, did we want to go or not? And of course we really jumped at the chance. Not only was it going to Moscow, and there were only about 3 days in each place, but we're going to Moscow, going to Uzbekistan, Samarkand and Bukhara, and also to Siberia. So it was quite an experience, okay, on paper before we went anyway. So we looked. Oh, sorry, I've changed. I've got that wrong, haven't I? I've talked about Russia. That's the second one. It should have been China I'm talking about. It was Shanghai, Beijing, Nanjing, and Chengdu. Okay, so this was an opportunity to see China that we hadn't seen before. And we flew out. Basically, we went to Pakistan for an Eid, and then from there we flew to Bangkok, because we had to change flights, and then from there we flew to Japan, and then from Japan we were going in with the group from America to China, Beijing. But first up we spent a few days in Thailand, so we had a look around and we had a tour guide and a car, and we saw the floating market, we saw the reclining Buddha, the golden Buddha, the jade Buddha, and so many other places, the palace, etc, etc, etc. And so a friend of mine had told me where to stay, so we had a hotel that we stayed in that was quite good. And we actually enjoyed it, although I couldn't say that I was really enamoured with the food, to be perfectly honest, but then so everyone's different, and maybe I was one of the different ones. But anyway, we went through it all, and we also went to a snake farm. And then after that we left and we went to Japan, and we flew into Narita, and we were supposed to be there for a day before the group came from America, and they said that we would do shopping in Tokyo, but just before we flew out to China. So we said, well, we won't go shopping. What do we do for a day? And we decided we'd go to Disneyland in Tokyo. So that's what we did. Okay, that's a bit different from going to Disneyland in America, for instance, or Paris. So we did that, and actually it was a very enjoyable day because the Japanese kids are extremely well behaved and quite natural, and they were enjoying themselves. And my wife was wearing the hijab and abaya, and someone came up to her and said, "Can I have my photograph taken with you? Because you remind me of the people living in my village." So she did, and we spent the whole day there. And then the next day, when the group came in from America, the organisers actually told us that the flight had been changed and we were flying out almost immediately. So we didn't get to see any shops in Tokyo, which was a little bit of a surprise. But anyway, you live with these things, and we didn't have that much money to spend on shops anyway. So anyway, we flew into Beijing, and in Beijing we actually had discussions with the Chinese Academy of Sciences and university and things like this. And what they were doing was they were having their own private companies making computers and whatever, but they weren't quite as reliable as the ones that were being made internationally. But they were starting, and the idea was to try to get the technology and try to get ideas. And the interesting thing for me was how they were handling Chinese, I would call them hieroglyphics rather than anything else, but the Chinese characters on the computers. And I mentioned earlier about Arabic on the computers, and having seen how the Chinese handled it, they had a little tablet that they used to write on, and that would actually reproduce the character in the computer. But you had to do the strokes in the right sequence. If you did it in the wrong sequence, you got a different character altogether. And every character they had like a computer dictionary for it, because they had thousands of characters, maybe 5,000, maybe more. So it was a big thing for them. And they had this type of input in Chinese, and they could process this in the computers and actually produce it in Chinese at the end as well. So it was quite a step forward. So it was quite encouraging, quite interesting talking to them from the professional point of view. But then, of course, we went up to see the Great Wall of China, so we actually walked on the Great Wall of China. And then we went round a lot of sightseeing in Beijing itself. Tiananmen Square, for instance, so we were flying kites. And then the Forbidden Palace, we went all around the Forbidden Palace, the Summer Palace, and the Temple of Heaven. I can't remember all the places that we went to, but we went to these sort of places. And of course, Mao Zedong's tomb was there. But the hard part for us was sometimes the food. The first night we were in Beijing, I'd actually contacted the secretary of the Beijing Muslim Association. I'd got the contact from people in Saudi Arabia and phoned him. He came to the hotel, and we went to one of the restaurants in the hotel, and he spoke to the chef, and they cooked food specially for us, which was halal. So that was probably the best meal we had all the time we were in China, you know. And then next night, the delegation said to us that they were talking to the organisers. They wanted to go to the vegetarian restaurant in Beijing because it was supposed to be well known. Well, we didn't know anything about it, and we said we've already caused them enough trouble because they weren't expecting people that didn't eat meat and things like this. So they actually arranged it, and we went to the vegetarian restaurant, and we had the place to ourselves. And actually, it was very good, the food. But after that, if you can imagine, sometimes for dinner we just had peas and rice, and we're eating these with chopsticks. And we weren't that familiar with chopsticks, so you can imagine. So in some ways it was quite an experience. In other ways it was, it was very educational, really. And then when we went to delegations in the university for talks, there'd be mugs in front of everyone and tea leaves in them, and they would fill it up 3 times in the day. So you got 3 cups with the same tea leaves, which was fine, except that the first cup was a bit strong, the second cup was just right, and the last cup was a bit weak. But it was good, and it was quite pleasant. And we had a good time going round. In the Summer Palace, when we were there was a prayer time, and we wanted to pray. And we told the interpreters with us that we needed to pray. They actually spoke to the people in the restaurant, and it was the end of the eating time for everyone. They actually moved the tables for us so that we had a space to pray, and then they sort of waited till we prayed, and then we carried on, So they were aware of the necessity of these things, at least in China. I tried to find out where the mosques were from the hotel, but in general they didn't know, or if they did know, they were in the old parts of the city, and no one knew the names or could explain the names in English. And I said, what about the taxi drivers? And they said, no, we can't let you go in like that. But it was easy to find the churches, because the churches had all been built in the modern parts of the cities. So in that sense, it was hard for Muslims to find the mosque. We did go to the very old mosque in Beijing, the 16th century one, and we had some sort of refreshments with the imam and the group of people there, and they showed us around, and we had a talk, because my wife could talk in Arabic, to the imam, and that was quite good. So, and also while we were going around the various parts of China, I was looking for Arabic writing on some of the shops, because the sweet shops, for instance, would have a form of Arabic on it. Okay, So there were quite a lot of these all over. So there is a Muslim influence there. And then we left Beijing and we go on to Chengdu. So I'll come to that in the next part, inshallah. So, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome back, dear viewers. Let's continue with the second part of this episode, where I mentioned I'm going to China, and we just left Beijing. We went to Chengdu, and basically all we saw there was about 17 pandas, and then we had some discussions with some companies there, and then we went on to Nanjing, and again a similar sort of thing there, and then we went on to Shanghai by train, which was another experience. We didn't fly this time, we went by train, and in Shanghai we actually took a boat trip down. And on the course of the boat trip, someone was telling me that they'd been on a boat and there was a Jamaat on one of the boats, and when it came time for the prayer time, they actually all got together and prayed. And I think actually it must have been a Jummah prayer from what the person had said, and they were surprised at what was going on, and they were watching it, and someone said, you can tell when they're saying their own words and when they're saying the words from Allah, because the recitation is different. When they recite the Quran, they said they can tell the difference in those things. So that was the only thing of interest really that happened in Shanghai as well. And then from Shanghai we flew out to Hong Kong, and then from Hong Kong we went on our way back to Saudi Arabia. So that was that trip. The same organization as People to People Citizen Ambassador Program, they then invited us to go to Russia. When Russia was breaking up, there was no private enterprise in general, it was all government, and what they wanted was to make contact with people so that they could actually find outlets for ideas that are coming out of the universities and being put into business units to manufacture these things. Okay? I mean, the only industry that was modernized in Russia at that time was the military industry. And if you can imagine turning military industries over to making refrigerators, for instance, and things like that, this is what was happening, because they were the only modernized lines that could do it. Okay, so I mean, someone came from Saudi Arabia and wanted to get a lot of Qurans printed in Russian, and the press that did it was the military press. Funnily enough. But we went through Turkey to get to Russia, because we couldn't fly direct from Saudi, and we spent a few days in Turkey, going out and coming back. We did the same route. Now, maybe I'll talk about that separately, but the interesting thing was that we got into Moscow, and from there we went to the hotel, and the hotel we stayed in was a hotel that had been used by the athletes when they held the Olympics in Moscow, and already it was beginning to degrade. It was getting dilapidated, and the ruble was going down quite quickly, because this was the time when the breakup of the USSR was taking place. We were actually in Moscow something like 3 days, I think it might have been as much as a week, but something like 3 days after Boris Yeltsin had stood on the steps of the White House and the tanks had rumbled through and actually crushed, I think, 3 people. So we were there only a few days after that, literally. But and they drove us around and they pointed out various headquarters of the security services and things like this, and told us some stories. And we only stayed overnight there, and then we flew to Samarkand in Uzbekistan. These were becoming independent now. And the interesting thing here is that the Russian translators, we had interpreters from Moscow, and when we got to these other places, locations, they would have local interpreters as well. But the main interpreters were from Moscow. And they were on the plane and were flying, and there's a lot of Americans on the plane, in fact nearly all Americans. And they're saying to them, when you get to Uzbekistan, the locals don't say hi, they don't say hello or good morning, they say assalamu alaikum. And the reply is, well, alaikum assalam. So just imagine what's going on here. You've got Russians who normally you would think as being communists, atheists, whatever, and they're explaining to Americans the Islamic greeting. And the Americans are repeating it back. We as Muslims can't get them to do that, but the Russians could. So when they get off the plane, they're walking up to people and saying, Assalamu alaikum. And in fact, some of them were practicing it with us because they knew we were Muslims. And then they would walk around and try to find whatever there was to see in the little markets or whatever. And so some of them were buying coins. And a lot of these had sort of Arabic inscriptions on them, and they'd bring them over to me or to my wife and say, what is this? And we would explain it to them, you know. And then when it came to the mosque, well, when it came to visiting places, sites, we would know some of the history, okay? Although we hadn't seen Rajasthan Square, which is the big UNESCO site, and there's 3 madrasas there which were built around about the 17th century, 16th and 17th century. And it's a fantastic site. Well, when we got there, we stayed in the hotel, and in the morning I got up, I wanted to pray Fajr, and I wanted to see if I could find a mosque. So I came down and I tried to get out the door, and it was locked. But the guard woke up while I was fiddling with the door, and he came and unlocked it for me. I said to him, Assalamu alaikum, sorry, Allahu Akbar. I said Assalamu alaikum first, and he didn't understand that. Then I said Allahu Akbar. I said, ah! And he opened the door and he pointed in that direction, you see. So I start walking, and I keep walking, and I keep walking. 20 minutes I've been walking down this road, and I still don't know where I am or where I'm going. And cars were swerving along and coming down and slowing down beside me. And as soon as they saw I was a foreigner, they would accelerate away again. Well, I couldn't speak the language anyway, so we weren't going very far. And then I came to this big square, and I saw these big 3 madrasas, and I didn't know what they were, but they weren't in use. But there were some people out working in the gardens, tending flowers at this time in the morning, okay? And I went up to them and I said, Salaam alaikum, and I'd say, wa alaikum salam, and I'd say, Allahu Akbar. And I'd point in the direction again, so I'd carry on walking, you see. And eventually I got to a place that looked like it might be a mosque. But I was a bit shy to go in the ground and start prowling around in case it wasn't. But there was a building opposite, and there was a light in the door, so I went and I knocked on the door, and someone came out and spoke to me, and I said Allahu Akbar, and they pointed and they said that's the mosque sort of thing. So I went over there and I went in the mosque, and then people came into the mosque to pray, and there was quite a group, and it was very friendly atmosphere. I spoke to some people after the prayer, and when we came out of the mosque, we just formed a semicircle as we came out. Each one shook hands and joined on the end, and we formed this semicircle, and then the Imam came round and shook hands with everyone, stood on the end, and then he did a dua, and then we all dispersed. So that was quite good. And I found out that there had been something of the order of 4 mosques were actually operational at that time, and they'd opened up some of the madrasas, and we went to one of the madrasas, and my wife went in with the interpreters and the group. I stayed outside with an interpreter, and a couple of little boys came along, and I said to the interpreter, what's the book that they got? He said, that's the Quran. And they could read it in Arabic, and they were 8 to 10 years old. So, you know, even so soon after the breakup of the USSR, these kids were coming back to Islam. And they said that they started off with about 80 students, and they'd already gone to 200 within about 2 weeks. So, you know, there was a big demand for it. And then we had the cultural programs and whatever else took place. And we went to Ulugh Beg's site, and we went to Timur Lane's, Tamar Lane if you like, or Timur the name, or whatever name you want to give him. And we went to his place, and there one of the guards saw me doing the Fatiha, and he came up and he said, Muslim? I said, Alhamdulillah. And he went down and came back with a plate of chilled melon. They got a lot of melons and a lot of fruit in Uzbekistan, and we were eating this, and then he took me right down into the crypt where the bodies are actually resting. Alhamdulillah, and I said the Fatiha. Some of the Americans followed me down to see what was going on, but they weren't as interested as I was. Anyway, Alhamdulillah. So with this we come to the end of this episode, Alhamdulillah, and inshallah we'll meet again for another one quite soon. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.